You know what's funny? The US plays tough on Iran and Russia, says don't sell oil, but China just laughs and keeps buying. They don't care about Trump's threats, and here's why. China has full control of the game. Let's start with the basics. The US under Donald Trump reimposed sanctions on Iran around 2018. They aimed to choke off Iran's oil exports and starve its economy. But Iran didn't stop because China stepped in. By 2024, China was buying something like 77 to 90% of Iran's oil, mostly in yuan, not dollars, according to the Wall Street Journal. Now here's where it gets juicy. All that oil heads to China through something called the Dark Fleet or Ghost Fleet. These are shadowy tankers that turn off their transponders, use fake flags or bill of lading, do ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, and rename themselves mid-journey. Their whole job is to hide Iranian oil in plain sight, and it works. Analysts tracked 12 transfers in just one day near Malaysia, as reported by CBS News. That ghost fleet kept Iran's oil flowing and let Iran earn up to $70 billion between 2020 and 2024. Without it, they'd have lost about $100 billion in revenue. But China doesn't stop at the sea. They're also building railway links, the emerging China-Iran corridor that directly connects both countries overland. That rail line gives China access to oil and other resources through ports up north, bypassing Western maritime choke points. It's part of the long-term 25-year China-Iran partnership and the even wider Belt and Road Initiative, where China funds infrastructure in exchange for oil at guaranteed deep discounts, roughly 12% or more off benchmark prices. So you've got Iran exporting via dark ships and China buying cheap oil in yuan, not US dollars, using rail links and signing strategic deals. Meanwhile, the US, especially under Trump, is losing its grip. Trump has threatened secondary sanctions and even proposed tariffs up to 100% or more on countries that keep buying Iranian or Russian oil. But newsflash, China doesn't flinch. At trade talks in Stockholm in late July/early August 2025, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent warned Chinese officials that their oil purchases from Russia and Iran might trigger steep penalties, even penalties cooked up by Congress. But Chinese negotiators made it clear, China takes its energy sovereignty seriously and will accept tariffs if needed. They said flat out they don't recognize unilateral sanctions. Meanwhile, oil flows anyway. Russian crude premiums in China stayed firm, say around $2 per barrel above Brent, because Chinese refineries, especially independents in Shandong province, are hungry for it. Trading data shows Chinese state majors and teapot refineries scooped up SPO blend and Urals oil even after Trump's threats. To simplify, China is a manufacturing powerhouse which is hungry for oil, and it doesn't really care if it's a few dollars more or less. China's playing chess, not checkers. They've been learning from Trump's first presidency. Back then, sanctions on Iran hurt but didn't stop Beijing. So this time around, China says, bring it on. We'll fight a trade war if necessary. They even said they'd go till the bitter end. Trump might hate Iran and Russia buying oil, but China literally doesn't care, and it makes Trump red in the face. That's if you can see past the thick orange fake tan. Let's not forget the environmental and health angle. That dark fleet isn't just shady, it's dangerous. Conducting unregulated transfers in open sea, mixing oil, ignoring safety rules has already caused spills. Analysts link toxins to cancer and skin irritation in coastal communities around Southeast Asia. Now let's talk about India for comparison. India also buys Russian oil, but when Trump's administration slapped export tariffs, India paused imports. They risked both New Delhi's access to oil and trade with the US. China? They shrugged. They absorb the hit. They keep buying at discounts, get more refiner margin, and sidestep any pressure. India had to slow down. China never did. Honestly, India was treated like a bad dog by its owner, the US, who proceeded to slap them on the nose with 25% tariffs. There's also the yuan versus dollar part. By paying in yuan via China's CIPS network, Beijing avoids SWIFT and US dollar channels. That reduces exposure to Western enforcement. It feeds long-term de-dollarization. It shrinks US leverage over time. So here's the narrative. Trump and the US try aggressive sanctions, threaten nations with huge tariffs, want to choke off Iran and Russia. They think hardline tactics will work. But China built infrastructure, banks, shadow fleets, refineries, both sea and rail routes to bypass those threats. They even set up teapot refineries that obscure the origin of oil. Meanwhile, Iran and Russia rely on China as their most trusted buyer. This is a classic example of strategy versus threats. China invested in long-term resilience, trains, rails, currencies, dark fleets. The US just yells, and every time the US yells, China turns its volume up. There's a deeper geopolitical consequence. China validates regimes isolated by the West, expands its influence, and calls the bluff on sanctions as effective tools. If anything, China gains leverage by showing it won't bow. Another point. China isn't doing this because they love Iran and Russia. They do it because they need energy and they see a chance to get it cheap and undermine American hegemony. They'll keep buying oil from Iran and Russia even during threats. And it isn't just theory. It's real. Oil flows, prices stay stable in China's favor, trade by rail and sea continues, sanctions don't stick. Now, if you're wondering why we don't see more conflict on the ground, well, there's less dramatic coverage because authorities in charge of enforcement can't find the exact vessel, or the paperwork says oil came from Malaysia or Oman. Shadow fleets spoof identities, shell companies hide ownership. That's a built-in defense system. So while Trump and the US posture hard, calling it maximum pressure, China keeps building value chains, yarn rails, shadow ships, UN payments. At this point, they don't just ignore threats, they laugh. They'll call it what it is. American play acting. And they'll keep turning Iran and Russia into energy partners who meet their needs. That's real power. What's next? If Trump's new sanctions or Congress passes super high tariffs, like up to 500% as some bills propose, they might nominally apply. But if China says fine and Iran and Russia keep shipping, enforcement becomes weak. It's a paper threat unless you can seize ships, freeze assets, and stop rail networks. China's gone all in to backstop Iran and Russia. This also signals a shift, a multipolar energy world where U.S. dominance is no longer decisive. China and Russia, plus Iran, are forming real economic links outside U.S. systems. And threats? They're just background noise. Alright, so let me wrap up the story. U.S. under Trump tries sanctions, threats of tariffs. China builds dark ships, railroads, refineries, UN payments. China buys Iranian and Russian oil, even at discounts. India blinks under threats, but China holds firm. Inside intel says China is ready to fight a trade war to defend this strategy. Iran and Russia rely heavily on China's purchase and safe haven. So in the end, China wins quietly, US threats ring hollow, and the world order slowly shifts. If you want the behind-the-scenes data, China bought about $29 billion of Iranian oil in 2024, mostly in yuan. They import via dark fleet. Ghost Fleet moves millions of barrels daily. China defied U.S. threats in Stockholm talks. Russia oil premiums stayed firm. India had to pause. China didn't. That's all backed by open reports such as on crossdockinsights.com. Here's my final thought. Don't believe threats when someone's built the full workaround. China has dodged the sanctions, kept oil flowing, and shown it's not going anywhere. U.S. threats sound scary, but until they can stop rail lines, seize shadow ships, freeze funds and UN networks, that threat is just noise, and China is winning. If you found this video insightful, then please like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.